Hi guys, today I want to talk about DIY surveillance systems. Now, this is for folks that want to set up the kind of thing that you might get from something like Nest or a paid service where you're basically just paying a monthly fee for this service to be able to log on to a service and see your video recordings or get alerts for when a surveillance system will detect something. This is basically setting up that, but instead of paying a subscription and a service, you're just using whatever you have available at your home. So you'll be setting up a computer to do a lot of the compute resources and then also installing cameras. So I'm going to walk through some of the jargon that goes along with setting up a DIY surveillance system and talk about the tech that goes into making it happen. Then I'm going to walk you through my setup, which is pretty basic. I don't really have a fancy setup, but I do want to talk about some of the things that I did, and maybe some of this will help you along your journey if you want to set up a DIY surveillance system in your home. So this particular slide is a basic representation of what you might have if you had a network that had digital cameras on it that was doing surveillance. Of course, you're going to have your cameras. We'll get into some details about what that entails in a moment, but the cameras are just basically there watching a specific area or room, wherever it might be. And those connect to a network somehow. And we'll get into the connectivity in a moment, but then that goes back to another piece of hardware that is either called an NVR or a DVR. Now, an NVR is a network video recorder, which is basically just a computer that is available for a camera to connect to, or that the NVR might connect to the camera the other way. And it just records the data that is being sent from the camera onto a disk. The disk is typically a high capacity disk, and it allows you to go back and review older recordings from the cameras. Sometimes this might be called a DVR. Now, for most intents and purposes, a DVR and an NVR serve the same purpose. Now, an NVR is typically just generic computer hardware, and a DVR is typically a dedicated system that has the ability to connect not only to network cameras, but also some proprietary connections or old analog equipment. Regardless what you have, it's basically serving the same purpose, and it's recording video. Now, there's other features that these two will have. An NVR or DVR, they might have the ability to do motion detection or object detection. And we'll get into that whenever I talk through my particular setup, which is using some AI to do some object detection in the context of an NVR. So with the cameras and the NVR and the DVR, you basically have the components you need to make all this happen. Now, of course, you might have other things connected to this network, and it might have the ability to upload things to the internet. But one thing that folks generally like to do is have the NVR or DVR notify them when something has been recorded or something has been captured by the NVR based on the data coming from the cameras. So you'll need some kind of internet connection, which is represented over here by the cloud. Now, that's not necessary. You don't have to have an internet connection for this to work, but if you want to get notifications about things that are happening on your network, generally speaking, you're going to need some way to send that notification from the NVR or the DVR or even the camera itself to the internet so that you can get a notification, be it a push notification or an email, or whatever it might be. So this is at a high level, the kind of things that you're going to need to make all this work. Now, of course, this gets really detailed when you actually start talking about what kind of technologies we're going to talk about and how you connect all this together. And I'm going to talk about some of those different technologies and some of the nuances of that, and then some suggestions on what you might want to do to plug all this together so that you have a secure network for doing surveillance, that you're not going to be compromising everything else on your network when you set this up. So I'm going to talk about camera solutions now. There are just so many cameras out there. It would be impossible for me to cover every single camera out there. So I'm going to look at this. There's three different categories. And the three categories are power, data, and protocol. Now, power is, of course, how do I power the device? How do I get electricity to the device so it's able to perform the function it was designed to perform? Data is how is the data from the device going to get back to the DVR or NVR. And the protocol is the language that the two are going to use to communicate with one another over that data connection. So within these three categories, there's a lot of different options. So let's start with power. So with power, one of the most obvious solutions is just using wall power. This is going to be very common for interior observation. So if you want to set up a camera inside of a room in your house, just plug it into the wall, use Wi-Fi, and you're up and running. So this is going to be very common for many of the cameras that are available. available. Another option is simply to use a light socket. Now, most people don't think about this, but a light socket can be a very useful solution for powering a camera. And if you have an exterior light, such as a floodlight, what you can do is remove a floodlight and replace it with a camera that is shaped like a floodlight, and it uses the socket for power and typically uses Wi-Fi for data. And this is a solution that will enable you to install a camera without having to run any kind of new wires to the camera. Another option is to use a battery, and this is typical for remote setups where there is no infrastructure. So you have a battery pack that is going to last several days, typically 30 days, maybe 50 or 60 or maybe even 90 days. And typically what these will have is a motion detector that will trigger recording, which typically uses more battery power to record for a period of time. And then it will shut off the recorder, and then you just go back to using a motion detector. And the motion detector uses only a little bit of power. And so that's what enables the battery to last a long time. And these solutions are great for like trail cams and things like that. But if you need a solution that's going to be available more 24/7 for recording, that's where you might want to think about solar. Now, solar setups are typically a kit that you install, and it's going to have a solar panel, it's going to have batteries and cameras. And then during the day, the solar will power both the batteries and the cameras. And then at night, when the sun goes down, the cameras will simply just use the batteries that have been recharged during the day. This is common in commercial setups that want to observe a large area. They'll typically have multiple cameras. But you can also get these for residences, and they will work on the outside of your house. So if you want to set up something without having to run new wires or anything like that, consider these. But they tend to be kind of expensive. So that is a caveat for this option. Now, if you're going to be setting up something that is going to be at your front door, a doorbell is typically going to have a DC loop that you can use to power a small doorbell camera. And that DC loop is typically there to power an LED, or at least to complete the circuit for whenever you press the button. That's what causes the chime to go off. What you can do is simply remove the doorbell and use that existing wiring to power a small doorbell camera. And that will give you the ability to install something without having to run any kind of new power. And it simply just uses Wi-Fi for its data connection. Now, Ethernet is one of the most common solutions in businesses and commercial setups because Ethernet is so ubiquitous in those setups. Now, Ethernet's not typically available in residences, but in businesses, it is actually something that most setups are going to be using for delivering both power and data, because you can deliver power over Ethernet as well as data over Ethernet. However, if you want to do this in a residence, it's actually not hard to run Ethernet. And I prefer this because Ethernet is a low power solution, and it's fairly inexpensive to get Ethernet cables of long runs. And the equipment is typically not very expensive either. In fact, a couple of my cameras that I have available are using power over Ethernet and data over Ethernet. So even if you don't have Ethernet in your home, it's actually pretty easy to create an Ethernet run. You can run it through a crawl space, through an attic, and they actually make flat cables that will work inside of rooms too, if you want to run it around the baseboard, around the edge of a carpet, or something like that. So an option to consider there for both power and data. Now, USB is one of the solutions that many folks might not think about, but USB can actually be both for power and data as well. USB is typically used for local devices, but USB cables can actually be fairly long. Depending on the version, some of them can be 30 feet, 60 feet, 90 feet, and even some solutions will allow you to do USB over Ethernet and get runs that are as long as 300 feet for USB cameras. And USB cameras are typically very cheap. The cables can be pretty cheap too, so this is a fairly decent option if you don't want to have to break the bank for cameras. And many computers have USB ports available on them. So if you're going to be converting an old PC into an NVR DVR, it's probably already going to have multiple USB ports available to it. And even if it doesn't, you can get an external USB hub and then have that deliver both power and data. And those USB hubs can be very inexpensive as well. So this is a great solution if you don't want to do something like Ethernet for runs. It can be very cheap for both getting cameras and data to your given cameras, whatever that might be. Another solution that's kind of emerging, and this tends to be very vendor specific, is coax. I didn't want to leave it out because many of the options that are available historically for old analog systems for CCTV deliver power and data over coax. Now, this never caught on for the digital cameras that are installed in most environments now, but there are some companies that are kind of experimenting with the ability to deliver both data and power over coax. but it's going to be digital data, not analog data. And so this is an emerging standard, and I don't know that it's emerged as a universally accepted standard, but I did want to mention it because there are some options out there, but you have to buy the both the power adapters for delivering the power and for delivering the data from a specific vendor. In this case, it's not a standard that is like USB or Ethernet that's going to be more widely available from multiple vendors, and they're going to be more compatible with one another. Now let's talk about some of the data solutions. Data is not going to have as many options as power, but there's certainly several that you want to consider. Of course, the most obvious one for most residences is going to be Wi-Fi because it's just so convenient to use it. All you really need to worry about is getting power to the device, and then Wi-Fi is going to be already available because a Wi-Fi access point is typically going to be able to cover an entire residence with a network signal that you can connect into. So very often, many of the cameras that you can buy for residences will support both Ethernet or Wi-Fi, but many of them only use Wi-Fi. So again, consider that if you don't want to have to run any cables. Another obvious one is Ethernet. I've already mentioned Ethernet for power, but it works for both data and power as well. Like as I said, 2 of my cameras that I have use power over Ethernet, and they use it for data as well. Another option, as I mentioned, for delivering data is coax. Now, of course, I mentioned that you can use coax for power, but that's an emerging standard. But some cameras for DVR specific purposes have the ability just to use straight up coax for the data. And some options have the ability to do Ethernet over coax. So if you have coax in your house already, which many residences do for television, you can typically use that for delivering data as well. You'd have to buy some adapters to make it work, but at the end of the day, you can adapt coax for delivering data for your devices if you want to make a run. And typically that's already going to be in the crawl space or in the attic, so you can tap into it with T connectors and all that kind of stuff to make coax part of your surveillance system. So it's very easy to use it, especially for residences that already have a lot of coax in the walls. Another one, of course, as I mentioned, is USB. USB can be for power and for data. And USB cameras, again, are cheap. And so you can use USB for shorter runs if you want to consider this as a part of your surveillance solution as well. So let's talk protocols that are going to work over the data connections that we've just talked about. Now, of course, one of the most common protocols for this kind of setup is RTSP, real-time streaming protocol. Is an old protocol. It's been around forever. It's probably not the best protocol out there, but because it is so ubiquitous, most cameras support it and most DVRs and NVR support it as well. So if you just look for cameras that support RTSP, odds are they're going to work with most recording solutions as well. It's somewhat insecure and not really a great protocol, but it is such a ubiquitous protocol that many different kinds of solutions will implement it just because of that reason and that reason alone. Another common protocol that is not as common as RTSP is WebRTC, and that's designed for basically streaming applications. Not all cameras implement this, but it is one that if your DVR and your NVR support, you can use it. It's typically used for streaming video to a browser, but you can also use it for other applications as well. One protocol that is emerging, not just as a streaming protocol, but as an entire protocol dedicated for the purpose of controlling cameras on surveillance systems, is ONVIF. And it does both the streaming of data back and forth between cameras and NVRs, but it also allows you to control the cameras. Like if you have a camera that has the ability to pan or tilt or zoom in, that was part of this particular standard. So it does all things camera in addition to streaming. So might be something you want to consider if you have a more fancy camera. If you can use it for ONVIF, then your NVR supports that as well. Then you get not just the ability to stream data, but the ability to control the camera in many, many other ways. Another one is just good old-fashioned MPEG. MPEG is a both an encapsulation protocol for video, but it can also be used for streaming as well. And so many cameras have implemented the ability to stream MPEG over Ethernet or over Wi-Fi. And if you can get a NVR or DVR that supports MPEG, then you can use that for as capturing video and so on. Another one is USB. Again, the protocol for USB is typically proprietary to USB itself, but USB for both power, data, and for the protocol, all connected back to your central server, is a full solution. So you get all three from the USB standard. So you get USB cameras that will send a USB video stream back to your device. The power goes over the same connection. The data and the protocol are all part of that standard. So it's something that you can definitely use for surveillance systems. However, it's probably not the best solution, but it's cheap. And that's why many folks have even implemented it as part of a DVR or NVR solution. Now, I want to talk about network security for just a minute, because network security is one of those things that people don't typically think about when they're installing cameras on their network. Now, they're typically installing cameras to improve home security, but in doing so, they might compromise the security of their home network. Now, I'm not going to talk about how to lock down a network to the nth degree, but there are some basic measures you can take to secure your home network that won't grant hackers access to your network. So when you install a device on your network, especially if you're installing it on the outside of your home, typically what you're doing is you're putting some network credentials into that device and then mounting it somewhere outside of your house. What a hacker can do is come up, grab the device, rip it off the side of your house, and then get the credentials off that device and then gain access to your internal network. Or if it's a wired device and you have Ethernet running to that device, what they can do is rip that device off of the house and then use that same connection to connect a laptop and then gain access to your network that way. In either case, they're getting access to your network by some device that's mounted on the outside of your home. So to mitigate against that, you create network segments. Now, the network segments are basically isolated networks that have the ability to talk to one another, but one of them is basically insecure and the other one is secure. And the way that you do this is by basically setting up a guest mode on your access point. Now, most residential access points have a guest mode on them that allows people that come over to your house to connect to your Wi-Fi, but they don't have any kind of visibility into your main network where your laptops and your tablets, your phones, your gaming systems, your televisions, and all that are going to be connected to. And that main network is also where you'd want to put your NVR as well to protect it from being compromised as well. Now, this device right here, your NVR or your laptop, will still be able to connect to devices on that guest network, but the guest network can't reach back into your main network. So typically the way this works is you have an NVR DVR right here, and it will initiate a connection back to your cameras that are on that guest network, and then it will then start streaming data over that connection, but it does not allow for the camera to initiate the connection back to the NVR. And so it is secure in that this guy is initiating the connection. And if that connection is ever broken, this guy can't reach back into that main network. And so this allows you to have that network segmentation. And by simply putting your cameras on your guest network, you are basically creating that network segmentation where it's on an isolated network away from all your devices. And so you're going to have that security built in simply by using a guest network. Now, if you're using wired devices, what you can do in this case is basically chain two access points together. Now, with a chained access point, what you typically have is you have a WAN connection that connects an access point to the internet. So that WAN connection is what you're plugging in your cable modem from, or your router from, or maybe this is your router or your cable modem, and it has built-in Wi-Fi and so on. And it is able to serve both as your isolated private network as well as your connection to the internet. And that's not unusual for a residential gateway to have both functionality for connecting to your external network and your internal network. It might have ports on it and an access point built into it for connecting Wi-Fi devices to. But in this case, what you can do is connect a second router to this primary router. And what you do with this one is you take this guy's WAN port and you connect it to this guy's LAN port right here. And this guy's LAN port serves as the internet connection for this router down here. So this guy's is going to connect this guy's LAN port, and then this guy's LAN port is then going to route traffic out to the internet. So your Wi-Fi will still give you access to the internet for all of your phones, your tablets, your PCs, and so on. It's going to connect to this second access point or second wired connection. Then it's going to reach out to this other router up here, and then that's going to reach out to the internet. And this gives you network segmentation in the same way that a guest mode network would give you, but it works for both wired connections and wireless connections by way of Wi-Fi. So if I had a mixed mode network like I typically have in my home, where I have some of my cameras that are both wired and some of that are both Wi-Fi, then I want to have a separate wireless network for them, and I want to have a separate wired network as well. And that's exactly what I've done. I didn't do it quite like this, but I used to do it like this, where I had all of my IoT devices and my cameras on a separate physical network that I then connected my main network to by way of a wired connection from my secondary access point that I use for my main network to this other access point that I use for all my IoT devices and my guests. And then that one then connected all of it to the internet. And that's one way to get network segmentation that's very easy to set up and do as well. So there's another way to do network segmentation in addition to the other two I mentioned, which are pretty straightforward and simple. Mine is a little bit more complicated because I'm using more enterprise grade solutions with managed switches and what are known as virtual LANs or vLANs. And a VLAN is pretty much the same idea, but what you can still use is the same physical wire, but you can separate the traffic using what they call VLANs on the same physical media. And so what you need to do that is basically a managed switch, which is what I have right here. A managed switch is basically a switch that supports VLAN technology, and it gives you some other features too, but it's primarily used for separating network segments based on VLAN tagging. Now, I know that's a lot of jargon, but for simplicity's sake, we're just going to call this orange network over here VLAN. I was just call it VLAN 40, and this green network down here, we're going to call it VLAN. Let's say VLAN 50, and you basically tag a network to use a VLAN number. It's a number that just basically identifies on the switch what VLAN we're talking about. Now, what I did with my managed switch is I have this trunk line right here, and that one supports both VLANs back into what this is, and this is basically my firewall. So my firewall is where all the magic happens for basically enabling traffic to flow between one network or the other. And so I have this trunk line here. This goes up to a PoE switch from my managed switch right here, and this will then inject power into the Ethernet that goes out to each one of my cameras. It also allows the cameras to connect back to my managed switch right here. And then all that traffic flows up back into my firewall. And of course, that goes out to the internet. Now, my managed switch is where all my devices are for my main network. That's where I have off of that, I have a couple of, I have another switch and then my access point and a couple other things that I have hanging off of that. And that's also where my NVR is, my DVR, and then also my laptop or my desktop or whatever I'm using. And that was represented by this green network down here. Now for the NVR right here to connect back to the camera, what it has to do is it has to go back to the managed switch, back to my firewall. Then my firewall does a loop back and then puts the traffic back onto the other VLAN off of VLAN 40 back on the off of VLAN 50 back on the VLAN 40, and then it comes back up at here to connect back over here to one of my cameras. So it's basically going back here, back up to the firewall, back down to the switch, up to my PoE firewall, and then to the camera. And then it basically follows that same trajectory back down for the return traffic. And that does put a little bit more traffic on the network because the network segmentation requires that everything flow through the firewall to make it happen. But this allows me to basically reuse some of the same physical lines without having to do any kind of additional kind of hardware for a lot of different things. But in any case, VLANs are a way to do it. I'm just using VLANs because I'm using VLANs for a lot of other reasons in my house, but I also use it for network isolation for all of my cameras to get them on their own network, to separate them so that I don't have to worry about giving unintentionally given access to my network by way of a wireless connection or a wired connection to one of my cameras. So here's a list of the gear that I'm actually using for my setup here. I have a couple of cameras on this. I have two different kinds. I have a Revo Data 5 megapixel PoE camera. I have two of these. They sometimes go by the brand Revo Tech, but you can get these on Amazon for around $50, between $40 and $50. They're 5 megapixel cameras that support PoE, which is basically the criteria I was looking for. I wanted the PoE cameras because these I could put in more of an outside exterior setup and just run a PoE line to those and provide data and power to those particular cameras. And I bought two of those. I already had a set of Samsung smart cams. I've had these lying around for years and I have been using them. I used them several years ago, just as standalone cameras. But I had them in a drawer, and I just did some research and found out they do support RTSP, which would allow me to use them with this setup. So you can get them online for about $20, but they were free to me, so I didn't pay a dime for them. And I have two of those. Actually, I have a couple more of them that I'm not actually using, but I'm using two in this particular setup. Now, to power the RevoTech cameras or the Revo Data cameras, I got this Steam Memo 5-port gigabit Ethernet PoE switch, which is an unmanaged switch, but I plugged it into my managed switch so that I could do the VLAN stuff I was talking about. And it powers these RevoTech cameras. And I think I paid $25 for that guy, and I just have one of those. I bought a couple of new Ethernet runs to run to these cameras over here. I bought some flat cable. Now, typically Ethernet cable is round, but I wanted the flat cable because I could run along baseboards and things like that. But I actually did end up running one of these to the attic to one of my cameras that I installed. And it works great for powering and also delivering data from these RevoTech cameras. And these other ones are I think one of these smart cams I'm using Wi-Fi on. Another one I'm actually just using plain Ethernet, and I plugged it to the wall with the wall wart. But I paid $12 for a 50-foot run, which is more than enough for what I'm doing here. I could get longer runs for more or shorter runs for less. And I picked up two of those off Amazon. And then using an old laptop for my NVR. So just basically an old laptop that I had laying around. And it's free. So I guess I paid for it a long time ago, like 7 or 8 years ago, but I wasn't really using it for anything. So I just upcycled it to use it for my NVR. And of course, I only have one of those. So my sunk cost in this, I have about $100 in new cameras. I have a $25 PoE switch, and then some Ethernet cable. So about $150, and I was able to get the gear and combined it with some old gear that I had laying around for a complete setup. Now I'm going to walk through the software setup to show you what I'm doing with all this gear. So this is the box that I'm using for my NVR. You can use Linux, Windows, or Mac OS for the software that I'm going to show you. This one just already had Windows on it, so I didn't feel like reformatting it to make it run Linux or whatever. That was really kind of outside the scope of what I was wanting to do. All the software I'm going to show you is cross-platform, and it'll run on any of the particular operating systems that are available to you. So if I click on this and type in system information, just to get a look at the hardware spec here, this is running a 6th gen i7, and I think this machine has 16 gigs of RAM or 24 gigs of RAM. So this is an old gaming laptop, and it has an old GTX 9060 in it. So if you're going to be doing this, if you're going to be running a lot of cameras and you want to do some of the AI, which I'm going to show you, you probably do want a GPU. You don't have to have a GPU to make this work, but if you're going to be doing a lot of object detection, you're going to want to have a GPU to make that run better. But you can still do all of this with a 4-camera setup like I have on a much more modest laptop that doesn't have a GPU or discrete GPU embedded in it. Some people have used things as more modest as a Raspberry Pi or something like that to do the very same thing that I'm doing. And the software I'm talking about would run on a Raspberry Pi on Linux anyway. So nothing particularly fancy about what I'm doing here. It's just I'm using an old laptop instead of a Raspberry Pi or a Linux desktop or whatever it might be. So that's the machine. Now, the software that I installed for this is 2 pieces of software to manage it. I used this one right here. This is from ISpyConnect. It's called Agent DVR. And this is my digital video recorder, or NVR. And this is a fairly powerful piece of software, and it's free. Now, there's a premium tier that you can sign up for, and it's got a lot of additional value-added software that you can get. But for for home setups like I'm doing here, this is a free piece of software, and it'll install, again, like it said, on Mac OS X or Linux, again, as advertised here. It doesn't require any external agents or any kind of online services. Everything is done right on the DVR software. So all the object detection is just brokered by this. So again, this is done so I don't have to pay a subscription. Now, this particular piece of software works with another piece of software called CodeProject's AI server. And you can get this for Linux, Windows, or Mac OS. I downloaded it for Windows and installed it. And basically what this does is allows you to use AI models as part of the object detection. So whenever you run a camera and you want to do like motion detection, what it will do to filter out some of the noise, like a tree branch moving or something like that, is it'll use AI to do object detection. You get little rectangles around objects that it's designed to detect. So I'm mostly interested in vehicles in my driveway and people in my yard. And that's one of the reasons I set this up, so that whenever things drive up in my driveway, vehicles or people are walking into my yard or whatever, I get some kind of notification that, hey, you might want to go look at what's going on. And so I don't need all like these kinds of detections like books and cups and boots and persons or whatever. I just want to know people and vehicles. And for the most part, it works fairly well. So I downloaded and installed that. I'm not going to walk you through how to do that. But once it's installed, you can get the service is pulled up right here. Now, this particular one is a CodeProject AI server. And you can scroll down and look for this particular CodeProject AI right here. And then you can go to the dashboard. And this is just showing you what's going on. You can see that it's running currently. And this one will allow you to install different modules. So you're going to want to install different modules for this to work. I'm using this one right here, this particular one right here, object detection. And so it's got a pre-trained model for doing object detection. And I'm using this one right here for object detection. So this is the one that I'm using to get object recognition for things like vehicles and persons. And so it's installed and it's ready to go. And once you've installed it, you just click the install button, it sets it all up. It will register itself, and then you're able to connect the DVR portion of this to this particular piece of software that's running. And as we saw over here on the status, it was doing a lot of that object detection while it's in real time. So the installation of the software for the DVR, again, it's just a download. You can download it and you just run this, the script right here. It's in a program that will install it. And once it's up and running, you configure it through a web-based system as well. So if you go over to the IP that it starts on, which in my case is 10.0.1.2, which is 10.0.1.2, and then it's on port 8060, I think. Rather 8090, not 8060. It's this. This is the interface for the DVR software. And I think it's the first time I've pulled it up on this box, but you could connect to this from any of the machines in your home on your network that can connect to your main network where your DVR is. And these are currently the two that I have in view, but if I click over here, you can see that I have a few other cameras connected. So I've been doing some dirt work in my front yard right there. And this is my driveway. And this is my backyard. Trying to get some things to grow back here, doing some dirt work as well to fill in some gaps. And then, of course, this is my dog camera, so that we have to put the dog in the cage so it doesn't destroy the house when we have to leave. And so we are able to keep an eye on him when he's away. And with these 4 cameras, this is my setup. These 2 are the ones that are the Revotech cameras, or the Revo data cameras, that are the 5 megapixel cameras. I've got these outside. They're mounted outside the house under awnings so that they can look down on my front yard, and then they look out on my driveway as well. And these are my PoE cameras. This one I just have hanging in a window. It's kind of over my shoulder right here. I just put it up in the window. It's just something to look out on the backyard through the window. That's why you can kind of see the window trim here. So you can see it. Maybe one day I'll replace this one with something that's a little bit more robust, but it worked for the purposes that I deemed it usable. So again, very straightforward right there. And this, of course, is using Wi-Fi. It's connected to Wi-Fi, and you can see that it's plugged into the wall right there. And it's, again, just for watching my dog. Now, once you've wired all this stuff up, it's pretty easy to add these cameras. And with this one, you can edit devices, and this is where you connect all of your devices right here on this particular system. If you come over here to add a device, you can add the device, but this is the properties for it. Again, I'm using RTSP for all of these. So if I look at my settings right here, you can see that this is using RTSP, and this is just the endpoint for it on this private IP address on my network. I've got a 10.0.4 that is the network that I'm using for my cameras. But my box right here is on a 10.0.1. That means I have that network segmentation going on. So this is actually flowing out through my firewall and back into my network through 2 different vLANs, as I mentioned earlier. So the cameras are isolated from my network and my main network that my NVR is on. And so that's how this is all set up. Now, for motion detection, again, you can do the motion detector right here. I've got it on the simple one. So basically anything that moves will trigger recording, but this sends it off to object detection, which is basically used for the object detection in the images. So that's what all of this right here is, object recognition. And if I go over here to object recognition, you can see that I'm using CodeProject AI server. And when there's motion detected, that triggers the AI server. And then the AI, it sends all the data over to the AI server. It's running on the exact same box, and that will do object detection. Now, once this has done the object detection, I have a notification set up, and that's handled by actions. Now, actions in this particular guy is just send an email. And so whenever the AI does an object found, I basically just have it to send a message to my email address. And that's what this does right here. So every 60 seconds, it'll send me a new email address. Now, when I originally set this up, I had it doing it as quickly as it found something, but my kids played in the front yard one day and I got spammed with like 500 messages over the course of about half an hour. And I was like, all right, I need to throttle this somehow. And that's why I have it set up for, every 60 seconds so that I'm not just getting spammed with email. And of course that goes to my phone and tells me something is in my yard. And it's pretty much instantaneous. So pretty much the second it detects something, about a second or 2 later, I get a notification on my phone. Hey, email from my NVR, my DVR. I tap on it. It gives me a screenshot of what I am looking at right here. Tell me what was detected. It'll put a little box around it. And it'll say that I detected a person or a vehicle or something running around in the yard. And it will also show me a screenshot. And then if I need to, I can go back and review a recording or whatever. This one's currently recording because it's detecting all the motion inside of this tree blowing around right here, but it's not doing any object detection. So it does sometimes trigger false positives because it's not foolproof, but overall, this does work fairly well. So again, adding the cameras to the system and setting it all up is pretty straightforward. Highly recommend ISpyConnect's Agent DVR for free use. It's great for home users. If you want to set something like this up and you can get the gear, you can have a full working setup like this for fairly inexpensive and not have to pay a subscription fee and just use some commercial software, but use it for free. But you get to have all of these cameras connected to it, and the cameras really aren't that much. So again, a very usable solution for what it actually cost me, and also gives me great benefit of knowing that I'm able to monitor my house when I'm away or when I'm not even at home or something like that. So it's a great way to just keep an eye on things and let you know what's happening.
If you like this content, please consider subscribing to the channel by clicking on the subscribe button. You can also like this content by clicking on the thumbs up or share this content with your friends, and also comment in the comment section down below. You can also find me online at www.blaze.net or on Twitter at @TheOneMule. And as always, thanks for watching.